Ghosts, slashers, creature features. Everyone has a favorite type of horror film, but why settle for just one? The horror anthology is unique in the sense that it has something to offer everyone. And tonight we take a look at the gold standard by which all others are measured. The most fun you'll ever have being scared, the ghastly montage of the macabre, Creepshow. The horror craze of the 80s was set to explode when Stephen King joined forces with legendary director George Romero and special effects wizard Tom Savini in 1982 to form the triumvirate of terror that would be the driving force behind Creepshow. Inspired by the controversial EC comics of the 1950s, Creepshow exuded a unique blend of black comedy and revenge-themed tales of horror. Boasting an all-star cast including Hal Holbrook, Leslie Nielsen, Ted Danson, Adrienne Barbeau, E.G. Marshall, Fritz Weaver, and even King himself, Creepshow was a uniquely stacked production. The addition of an epic virtuoso score by John Harrison provided the perfect tapestry for the carnage to play out over. Creepshow was a rousing box office and critical success, and 5 years later in 1987 a follow-up would be released to respectable albeit inferior results critically. Once again, however, Stephen King's stories were used and George Romero penned the screenplay, this time revolving around 3 stories in a wraparound instead of 5. That would effectively be the end of the franchise for decades. A Tales from the Dark Side film would be released in 1990 that included at least one story that was originally proposed for Creepshow 2, and was directed by John Harrison, the composer of the score from the first film. Many people consider this to be the real Creepshow 3, but 16 years later, Taurus Entertainment would foist upon the world one of the most detested films in the history of the horror genre. Largely dismissed as an illegitimate entry in the series, it was cast into the proverbial lake of fire by the horror community, and that's where the franchise remained, until being pulled out of the inferno by Greg Nicotero in 2019. A new series was put together for Shudder, a fledgling horror streaming service. Although it failed to reach the heights realized by Creepshow 1 and 2, it was a welcome reprieve from the memories of the previous debacle, and provided some decent episodes. Also in 2010, there was a one-off oddity named Creepshow Raw, a single episode released on YouTube starring Michael Madsen of Kill Bill fame and directed by Wilmer Valderrama, otherwise known as Fez from That 70s Show. It was a surprisingly good entry and would have ranked as one of the better episodes on the Shudder series. Was it a prototype? Who knows, but it bears mentioning. So with that being said, we're going to be ranking the segments from the first 2 Creepshow films, as well as giving a couple of brief points about the Shudder series, and yes, even the reviled Creepshow 3. Number 8. The Lonesome Death of Jordi Verrill. A rare acting appearance from Stephen King drives this bizarre tale of misfortune. King plays the title character Jordi, a dim-witted rural schmuck who thinks he's struck it rich when a meteor lands on his property. Unfortunately, when he dumps a bucket of water on it, the meteor cracks and he subsequently sticks his finger in the resulting ooze. This causes a green, weed-like fungus to begin growing on him, and it isn't long before the situation has escalated to a point where Jordi realizes it's not a matter of if, but when. Perhaps the most comedic entry of the 2 films, this isn't a bad story, it's just different. What it lacks in scares, it makes up for with its sense of foreboding and doom. King gives a cartoonishly over-the-top performance, and while it's not necessarily what I would consider to be good acting, he does manage to carry what is mostly a one-person show and deliver a few classic lines along the way. Number 7. They're Creeping Up on You. In one of the most memorable performances of the series, E.G. Marshall portrays an absolutely detestable germaphobe gazillionaire named Upson Pratt. He lives alone in an extremely sterile-looking apartment where he spends his nights following stock trends and obsessing over the cockroaches, both literal and metaphoric, that he fears are trying to conquer him. As the story progresses, Pratt's hilariously beyond-the-pale behavior reveals a character we can truly revile. Never thought you'd be rooting for cockroaches, did ya? Speaking of roaches, a surprisingly large amount of the film's budget was used on these vermin. In fact, each cockroach cost a reported 50 cents, and you can imagine what that added up to. When I was younger, I used to skip this episode most of the time. Something about it was so disturbing, coupled with its placement at the end of the film, that I would often find myself turning it off. They're Creeping Up on You is a good premise with a great performance, but once again it's mostly a one-man show, and frankly, it's just a little too unpleasant to be any higher on the list. Number 6. Father's Day. The quintessential EC Comics tale of revenge from beyond the grave. Father's Day plays out like the cover art from a Vault of Horror issue come to life. A wealthy family with a dark secret is picked off one at a time by the vengeful revenant of the murdered patriarch. A fairly straightforward entry, Father's Day is short on surprises but long on great visuals, and even packs a respectable body count into its relatively short running time. The perfect opener to kickstart the film, there's nothing wrong with Father's Day, it's just a little bit on the remedial side. Number 5. The Hitchhiker. What at first seems like a classic story of infidelity takes a savage swerve when Annie Lansing accidentally smashes a hitchhiker on a treacherous stretch of highway while trying to get home undetected before her husband. Plagued by guilt, Annie suffers what she initially believes to be a horrifying series of hallucinations in which she is attacked repeatedly by the increasingly mangled hitchhiker. After several harrowing battles, Annie returns home with her car in almost total ruin. Once she closes the garage door, the vengeful apparition appears one final time in an even more ravaged state. I've heard people argue that this entry hasn't aged as well as others, but every Creepshow fan is well familiar with the haunting refrain of "Thanks for the ride, lady," and it remains one of the most memorable chapters of the original duo of films. Number 4. Old Chief Woodenhead. A dusty old ghost town serves as the backdrop for this one, as a trio of local thugs led by narcissistic baddie Sam Whitemoon rob a struggling general store and end up murdering an elderly couple who owns it. Later that night, the wooden Indian statue that stands guard outside the shop comes to life and sets about avenging the slayings. The special effects on this particular character always really stood out to me. The sound design of his creaking footsteps and that haunting howl into the bitter night sky. Combine that with the deliciously over-the-top portrayal of antagonist Sam Whitemoon, and you have one of the more underrated stories in the franchise. Number 3. The Crate. Far and away the longest entry from either film, The Crate is much more sophisticated and intelligent than your average anthology story. After stumbling upon the very lethal inhabitant of a crate under the stairs at the local college, a professor enlists the help of his colleague to deal with the ravenous beast. Seeing an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone, Professor Northrop hatches a scheme to feed his absolute witch of an alcoholic wife to the carnivorous quadruped. The plot succeeds masterfully, and the two professors celebrate over a game of chess after the crate is chained up and dumped into a deep quarry. Sporting memorable performances from esteemed actors Holbrook, Barbeau, and Weaver, as well as perhaps the most iconic creature from the franchise, the crate has a lot going for it. If anything, the only drawback could be that it feels slightly overlong when compared to the other entries. Number 2. The Raft. 4 college friends drive to a remote mountain lake where they have an unfortunate series of encounters with a malevolent flesh-eating oil slick. This passage serves a more simple story than its predecessor on the list, and therein lies the beauty. The simplicity of its premise allows for some surprising character development under the surface. There are a lot of underlying themes about the relationships between these 4 people played out as they are suddenly cast into a life or death struggle against a mostly undefined predator. Randy's jealousy of Deke and desire towards his best friend's girlfriend. Rachel's understanding and resentment of this dynamic, and Deke's almost complete obliviousness to all of it. None of these juxtapositions are spelled out explicitly, but they're all still effectively communicated. A tense final confrontation and shock ending propel this modest story to surprising heights. Number 1. Something to Tide You Over. The crown jewel of the franchise comes in the third story of the first film, featuring Leslie Nielsen in an unforgettable turn as a vindictive husband who seeks some rather inventive means of revenge against his adulterous wife Becky, played by Galen Ross, and her beloved Harry, portrayed by a pre-Cheers Ted Danson. Richard devises a horrifying scenario in which he buries them to their head in the sand at the beach and then waits for the incoming tide to drown them while filming it and watching it at home via closed-circuit television. With this unbelievably sadistic act complete, Harry goes about his evening, but is stalked and eventually confronted by the ghastly, waterlogged remnants of Harry and Becky. It's an incredibly original and brilliant take on a more traditional underlying story, and it works to perfection. The acting is brilliant, the score is bone-chilling, and the makeup effects spectacular. This is the episode that so perfectly captures the essence of what this film is setting out to accomplish, with its vicious blend of dark humor against deadly serious scares. Tide is an easy selection for the number 1 spot on this list. And that brings us to You Got It, one of the most reviled films in all of horror history, the appalling dumpster fire that is 2006's Creepshow 3. Now, even with a film like this, and I'm using that term very loosely here, I want to be fair. There are a couple of decent ideas here. I can see where the script for the Call Girl segment may have looked alright on paper, and the creature design there was also pretty good. That's clearly the best segment to me. Also, some of the basic story elements for the radio and the professor's wife may have had some glimmer of promise at one point, but much less promising would be the remaining 2 segments, Alice and the haunted dog, which are flat-out horrible ideas at even the most basic level. That's to say nothing of the absolutely atrocious acting, abysmal camera work, non-existent score, and perhaps worst of all, that dreadful, vomit-inducing animation that rears its ugly head in the wraparound segments. The film is an abject failure on every front and a stain on the property that will prove hard to wash out. Greg Nicotero would try, however, to right some of these injustices in 2019 with his new series for Shudder. Overall, it was a worthy effort and a massive improvement on the 2006 debacle. The stories are penned by a variety of authors, including King, and guest directed by a range of people including Nicotero and John Harrison, who previously directed Creepshow 2 and scored the first film. As you might expect, the episodes vary somewhat in quality, with a couple of my personal standouts including Night of the Paw and Lydia Lane's Better Half being well worth looking up. The series was generally considered a modest success and was renewed for a second season that is slated to begin filming as soon as restrictions from COVID-19 are lightened. And that's where we stand today, Creepshow, arguably the greatest horror anthology of all time, and well, some of the other efforts in the franchise. I hope you had as much fun revisiting these films as I did. They have a special place in the blackest quarters of my heart. And speaking of that, until next time, try to stay out of the dark.
See anything you like? Stab those like and subscribe buttons to keep up to date on all the latest features and retrospectives. Special thanks to our Facebook group members. Be sure to join the discussion at facebook.com/groups/BigChillTheater.